Please pray with me. For generations, God, you have spoken your word to your people, and for generations, your people have sought to understand. As our ancestors did, so we do now today. And as you did for them, may you do again for us, granting us ears to hear and hearts to accept your wisdom to us this day. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Our scripture passage for this morning comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 9. Let us listen together. Isaiah writes, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you, as with joy at the harvest, as people exult when dividing plunder. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, you have broken, as on the day of Midian. For all the boots of the tramping warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. For a child has been born for us, a son was given to us. Authority rests on his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." This is the word of the Lord. On a perfect fall Saturday morning this past October, while on a weekend visit to my hometown in Asheville, North Carolina, my parents' younger sister and I decided to visit the grave sites of both sides of our family. It had been a couple of years since my last living grandparent, my paternal grandfather, had died. And I had also never been to the grave where my maternal grandmother was buried, as I had not been able to attend her funeral. So on this perfect fall Saturday morning, on a rare weekend when both my sister and I were in Asheville, my family decided that paying a visit to those family members who had come before us would be a good way to spend some time together. My dad's parents are buried in a beautiful cemetery that has panoramic views of the Appalachian Mountains. Their graves sit in the choice location right at the top of a hill where the views are the most striking. Apparently, this was the work of my paternal grandmother's oldest sister, who purchased a number of plots for her family about 70 years ago. Her grave is located just behind my paternal grandparents, along with the graves of other great aunts and uncles and my great grandparents. My mom's parents are buried in a cemetery a few miles from the farm where they spent the majority of their lives. The path to their graves is lined with majestic oak trees, and it has the effect of making one feel like they are walking down the aisle of an outdoor sanctuary. Lines of gravestones bearing the familiar names of the families who have lived in western North Carolina for generations line each side, much the way that pews line the floor of a church, all facing toward the altar. Only the altar in this case is another beautiful mountain view of rolling hills and valleys, which are themselves symbolic in a way of life itself. Given my career, I have spent a fair amount of time in cemeteries, but it is, of course, always different when one is in the cemeteries that hold their family. Those they have known and loved and lost, those whose lives were, for a time, intricately and intimately connected to their own. Standing in the cemeteries where my family are buried, I found myself moved, as many often are, to talk to the gravestones as if the people that they represent could somehow hear me. I was fortunate enough to grow up being very close to my grandparents, and so even though they are dead, being in the place where they are buried felt like being a little closer to them. And that, in and of itself, seemed to activate the bond that I had always felt with them. What's more, because they have passed on from this life to whatever lies beyond it, my urge to talk to them was driven in part, I think, by an urge for reassurance. That they have faced what no one living has. They have returned to the heart of God, and so perhaps from that place they could send me some sense of comfort, of peace, sending that back to those of us who are still alive and still wondering about what life holds for us. I know I'm not alone in these feelings I had while visiting my family gravesites. Many people, and indeed many cultures, feel the same way, the urge to look to the past, and indeed to those who have passed for reassurance about right now and what is to come. And while I am no anthropologist, I would think that this desire to somehow know the future by connecting to the past is as fundamental to what it is to be human as having flesh and bone. It is in our DNA, so to speak, and like our DNA, our own past and future wind around each other. One is never fully separate from the other. Who we are is formed by those who came before us, and so too is who we will be. And it is this double helix of the intertwining of past and future that Isaiah articulates in the passage that I read a few moments ago. He writes primarily in the past tense, the people who walked in darkness, a child has been born, a son was given. But all the while, he points to the future that is to come, offering a word of hope to those in the present time in which he was speaking, which scholars believe may have been people living in the 8th century before the Common Era, a time that was marked by great change in the world's civilizations, intense tribalism, and frequent war, particularly for the people of Israel, who were Isaiah's audience. These were people very much in need of reassurance about their future, people who longed to know that the violence and hardship that dominated their lives would not do so forever. They were people who needed to be told, needed to be reminded that for those who had once lived in a land of deep darkness, light had, in fact, shined. It is counterintuitive in a way, and it is certainly countercultural what Isaiah does here. Instead of looking ahead and trying to predict the future as a way of reassuring people, Isaiah looks back, and he reminds people of the past as a way of offering comfort and hope. In this way, he binds the promise for the future to the past, saying, in essence, remember that things have been bad before, but they became good again. There was a time of darkness, but then the light came again. And in this way, Isaiah reminds people that the hope they seek comes not from knowing what will happen, but from remembering what already has. Another way to look at it is to take that moment when I was standing at the grave sites of my grandparents, and instead of wishing to be able to communicate with them in some fanciful spiritual way, where from their place beyond the grave they might be able to see the future and let me know somehow that it's all going to be okay, Isaiah suggests that the more faithful, and indeed the more realistic approach, is to remember that every generation has needed hope for the future, and that hope has always come. Despite how bad it has been, and indeed it has been quite bad at times, at no point in human history have people decided to throw in the towel. Life has continued on in spite of all that has taken place in a seeming effort to stop it. Amidst all the evils of history, people have still found hope enough to keep falling in love, keep having children, keep creating families, and then watching those families grow and continue on. How we create those families has evolved over the years, but what has not changed is that all of us still remain part of one, both as members of our individual families and as members of the collective human family. And to stop and think for a moment of all that the generations before us had to face in order for us to even be here today is to, at least as far as I'm concerned, find what is perhaps the most solid and lasting form of hope that there is. My own grandparents and great-grandparents found hope even while living through World Wars I and II. They found hope to carry on amidst the Great Depression. Some of them had to rebuild their lives after a fire took everything that they had, while others had to farm the land and work 2 jobs just to feed their children. All of them had to make hard choices about money. They all had relationship challenges, job worries, and health concerns. And they all surely had times too when they wanted reassurance that their own futures would be secure. But they must have found that reassurance somewhere. or else I would not be here today. The same of which can be said for each and every one of us. And that's why Isaiah ends this passage with what is the equivalent of a birth announcement. Over the years, this passage has come to be interpreted by Christians as a foreshadowing of the birth of Christ. But at the time when Isaiah said it, he was talking about a specific birth of a child born to a king in Judah. And the central message of his words were that birth, the renewal of life, the continual march of humanity toward an unseen future is itself a sign of hope and a reason for confidence in that future. God has never abandoned us, Isaiah reminds the people, and so there is no reason to think that God ever will. That even amidst the harshest of circumstances, life has still continued to come forth. Children have still continued to be born. Humanity has still chosen to usher into this unpredictable and chaotic world vulnerability and weakness in faith that it will overcome even the worst that this world can create. How can hope not be found in that type of determination? So this Advent and Christmas, before we can get to the story of Bethlehem and the child who was born in a manger because there was no room in the inn, homage first needs to be paid to all those who came before that child. All those who made it possible for that child to be born, because in all of the centuries before him, no one ever completely lost faith in the possibility that the future can hold. Maybe that's why, if you look in Matthew's gospel, what you will find is that the very first thing listed there is not the story of the birth of Christ, but instead it is the genealogy of everyone who came before him. The people whose stories lie along the margins of the Christmas story, but without whom the Christmas story never would have happened. And so perhaps for us too, this season, as we keep our eyes open for the inbreaking of light and the promise of hope that it brings, as we wait and watch over the coming weeks with anticipation for what the future of this Christmas will hold, maybe we too can find time to listen to the stories from our own past, to remember the Christmases that came for those before us. And in this way, whatever it is that we may find ourselves hoping for this year, maybe it is not to be found by looking for what will come, but by remembering all that already has